Welcome all. We're going to introduce our additional panelists, and then we'll start the Q&A. So joining us on stage is Dr. Byron Craig. He's the Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer and the Assistant Professor in the School of Communication. And Dr. Zeng, Associate Professor in the Woodstock Canton College of Fine Arts and head of the film sequence. So thank you both for joining us up here.
Still going, oh my God.
Dr. Carpenter, if you'd like to go ahead and start us off the panel question and see where it goes.
I mean, I had ideas for a question earlier, and then during the day you gave us kind of the origin story of this for one of the classes. I'd like to hear that origin story again.
All right, I'll try to keep it as quick as possible. So, when I was a kid, I saw Enter the Dragon for the first time, and I was obsessed with that movie. I love that movie. I still think it's one of the greatest martial arts movies. Actually, it's more of an action film, but that's irrelevant. Jim Kelly was in that movie, and I was obsessed with Jim Kelly, because I'd never seen, as a kid, I'd never seen a black actor like that before doing, in a role like that. I was just obsessed. So, and I saw that movie really, I was pretty young. And then years later, I was in New York City, walking through Greenwich Village, and I saw a Bruce Lee t-shirt hanging in a store. And I was like, oh man, that Bruce Lee t-shirt's badass, but I want a Jim Kelly t-shirt. And so I spent the entire day walking throughout New York, all over Greenwich Village, then I went up to Harlem, looking for a Jim Kelly t-shirt that I could not find. So what do you do when you want a Jim Kelly t-shirt, but you can't find one? You decide to make your own, okay? So this was the early 90s, I'll say around 91, 92, and I'm obsessed. I have to have my Jim Kelly t-shirt. But first I gotta find a really good image of Jim Kelly to use to make the t-shirt. And so I'm looking, and I eventually go into a used magazine store, and I found an old issue of, I think it was Black Belt magazine. And it was from the early 80s, and it was like, whatever happened to Jim Kelly? I just bought the magazine, I flipped through it, saw this great image. I'm gonna use this image for my t-shirt. I bought it, and then I read the interview about whatever happened to Jim Kelly, and in it he was talking about how his career fell apart and how Blaxploitation movies died off, and I never knew any of this stuff. I didn't know this stuff about the movies, and I remember thinking, man, someone should make a documentary about Jim Kelly and whatever happened to him. And it started there, but I kept telling people I knew who were more accomplished filmmakers than I was, hey, you should do a documentary about Jim Kelly and maybe about Blaxploitation movies. And everyone kept saying, yeah, no, I don't think so. And so eventually, like an idiot, I decided to do it myself. And it took about 2 or 3 years to really work up the nerve to try to do it. I'd never made a documentary. I'd never made a film, for that matter. I'd worked on some movies before, but I'd never done one myself. And so what started out as basically was going to be a fun documentary about Jim Kelly evolved into this. And that's kind of the version of the story I told this afternoon, right? So there's probably more profanity this afternoon.
So I've watched this documentary a few times, and one of the things I was curious about is, as you mentioned, you haven't seen it since 2005,
yeah.
Right? When Dr. Carpenter and I were putting this class together, there were folks who were like, well, why these films? Why this era? What can that speak to today? And we obviously had our perspectives. I would like to hear all of your perspectives based on your experiences, your scholarship, your interests. What's something that you took from this documentary that you think is important to discuss today?
I can start. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good. So, I watched it this afternoon sitting in my office, right? Trying to do things about diversity and equity and inclusion on campus. And as I watched it, I think one of the most striking parts of that for me was thinking about that period between the end of that genre, right? And how long it took for another, and I'll just call it another film genre to start, right? And it spoke to me probably about the notions of power, right, and capitalism in the film industry, and the difficulty to have film that's about Black folk, right, created and produced and shown. But then another part of it that really spoke to me was this notion of the critique that we make of ourselves with film, right? So I'm even thinking about when, oh gosh, what's the film called that just came out? American Fiction, right? So I have a lot of friends who are historians, Black historians, and a lot of friends who do Black film studies, and the critiques and the arguments that went back and forth about that film, right? And the complaints about the film.
And nothing changes, right?
And nothing changes, right? And I guess we could say the same thing about The Color Purple.
Yeah.
Right? And then the other one that's coming out, the League of the Magical Negro.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And just the kind of public debates about these films. And I love for that, the debates to happen, but I worry about the publicness of those debates, right? It kind of scares me a little bit because I'm at a point now, I think, in my life where I worry about that, the public debates about those films and the way we talk about those films ourselves. And I might be the oldest one up here on this stage, right? And so when they talked about the NAACP, right? And I remember some of those covers on Jet and Ebony magazine, because we got Jet and Ebony in my house, right? And I remember some of those covers, and I remember the debates that my parents had about those films also. So my father was a real conservative Republican. My mother was a very progressive Democrat. And just to hear the way my father would talk about, why do we have to present ourselves that way? And my mother was saying, but this is just one side of us. And so growing up and hearing those debates, and so watching this today, it made me think about, it brought back all those memories of hearing about those, or hearing those debates in my own house, right? Whereas I had brothers who were shopping from Flag Brothers. I don't know if you all remember Flag Brothers. No. So Flag Brothers was a Black fashion magazine, right? And so you could go to Flag Brothers and order your, what were the shoes called?
Like the platform
shoes
and the
right?
maxi coats and all that.
Maxi coats and stuff like that, right? Well, in my little small town of Sandusky, Ohio, it was like, oh, they're wearing those clothes because of those films, right? So it was that constant critique, and I remember the NAACP in my hometown being very vicious about these films, right? Now, I will say I never saw those films as a kid. My first experience with seeing someone who looked like me on the screen was probably Star Trek with Lieutenant Uhura, right? That was probably my first experience, and I wanted to be Lieutenant Uhura. I was like, yeah, I like her, right? I'm queer, right? And so that's what I wanted to be like, was Lieutenant Uhura. So, but it was really important also to see that representation, right, on the screen, because everyone Black was watching Star Trek to see Lieutenant Uhura. So there's so much. The reason I love this documentary so much is because it nuances our experience as African Americans with Black film, whether it be Blaxploitation, films, the films of the '90s, or even films now. I think there's such a nuanced conversation we can have about them. So, it does, and I'm just going on and on. I have to answer too. I think that documentary sparks a lot of conversation, and it really makes us think about, in our scholarship, how we need to nuance the genres, whatever genre it is, of film first, and then, because film is exploitation of identity, right? That's what it does.
Okay, so I have to say, like I'm an Asian American, so I'm not. I'm a film. I see myself as as a film scholar, so that's how I talk about my point of view. I'm not a black cinema expert, so it's watching the documentary. I also really learned a lot. I think it's historically, this is a great and documentary. And I'm also same as you. I was watching it, putting myself as a film critic. And we pretty much also involved in debating and discussion about the films. And even in the class, have a lot of discussion with my students. One of the first questions students always come up would be whether the representation of the black character is a negative image. So it's always come up with, oh, if it's negative, if it's this person's portrayed as bad, and this is a racist film. So it's always come to this very kind of direct, superficial, that evaluation, not necessarily say that film is not racist, but the way to talk about the film, whether simply from just to say whether it is a negative representation, is kind of simplify the context, which I think this documentary laid out. I think for black exploitation films, and which I find is it's really compelling, is that the people you interviewed from different perspectives, and they have some people say, yeah, they consider that is very empowering, but they also have actors or directors say they feel towards the end, they feel like the film may portray some, perpetuate some negative perspective. So you have like the different opinions, but one thing I feel most of them point out the frustration of really what kind of freedom you have during that time. And when they are making the film and the industry which is really controlled by white like executive. And so when they see these type of films make money, and they would just say like continue to make this film, and rather than different type of films, and like the gangsters, but not making the films about lawyers or the other type of characters. So I think like when we criticize the films, we should also think about the film as an industry, and rather than you do not control the image, but also who control the industry and to decide what type of films to make. So I would just stop here.
What am I supposed to say now? What was this? Well, I mean, it's interesting because again, I haven't watched this movie in a long time, and so what kind of struck me was I was thinking about like where we are now, right? And the big difference as to where we are now, which is that every single myth that they were talking about in terms of the finances and the business has finally been destroyed, right? There's three movies in particular, Get Out, Creed, and Black Panther. And those three movies destroyed everything, right? Because they made so much money, and we're finally at a place now in 2024, we hit it probably around 2015 or so, where the promise of what was started in the 70s was finally fulfilled. And it took, because the first half of the 80s was garbage, there was nothing came out until, I shouldn't say nothing, there were some significant movies, Color Purple, Soldier Story, probably the two most, but they were directed by white directors. And then the real significant thing was '86, was Spike Lee's first movie came out. And you can hear when everybody's talking about stuff and they're referring to, some of the big actors of the time, they're still talking about Clint Eastwood like he was like as an actor was a major draw. He's not anymore, but back then he still was. So what I look at now is like, okay, how much things have changed, but how much things have stayed the same in some ways. I mean, the fact of the matter is that The Color Purple wasn't nominated for any Oscars this time around, this version, or very few. nominations. Back in 85 or 86, the original film version was nominated in 11 categories and didn't win any, okay? And, you know, I was having this discussion like around early January of this year. This was the first time ever where the Oscars were set up to be swept 100% by Black talent. There was enough movies between American Fiction, between The Color Purple, there's another one that's escaping me right now, where it's like every major category a Black person could have been nominated, and it didn't happen. And I knew it wasn't gonna happen, but I was really kind of disappointed because I was like, maybe this will be the moment. And the Oscars are a load of crap, to be 100% honest, but they're still, we still live in a time where the two measures of success of a film are how much money they make and how many Oscar nominations did they get, or how many awards did they get. Those are the biggest measures, and it doesn't necessarily mean a film is good or not, because, you know, Oppenheimer was nominated for some stuff, and I don't think that that's a good movie, so that's me. But it's interesting watching this, also knowing that I'm now older than some of the people were when I interviewed them. I'm older than Jim Kelly was when I interviewed him. You know, Ron O'Neal, Fred Williamson, Jim Brown were a little bit older than I am now, but not much. And I was a kid. I was just, you know, I was in my 20s at the time. And so that was also just weird, watching this and just sort of, you know, thinking about the patterns as they exist. Dr. Roland Jefferson, I think he's the one who said about this generation that was lost. Because Blaxploitation pretty much, it really ended around 78, 79. The movie that killed it was The Wiz, right? And if you study the history of The Wiz and what a tremendous box office failure it was, and when you talk to people who were around, for years they were using The Wiz as an excuse to say, yeah, we can't make any more Black movies. The Wiz lost too much money, and so there was this, so all of the directors who were working in the 70s, there wasn't a lot of directors, there wasn't a lot of producers, there was a ton of actors, but everybody stopped working for the most part. And some of them never came back. They never came back theatrically. You know, none of the big major stars continued to have stardom into the 80s, right? They were replaced. Richard Pryor was the only actor from that era whose star continued to rise, but then it quickly crashed. Eddie Murphy came along, and Eddie Murphy made so much money that they felt they didn't need another Black actor, another big star. And it wasn't until probably around Denzel Washington, really, that they had another star that they could bank on, right? And for the longest time, it was always just one or two that they could bank on. But the thing that really I started thinking about, and when Dr. Jefferson said that thing about this generation that was lost, I realized that the exact same thing had happened in the 1950s with the television show Amos and Andy. And Amos and Andy went through the exact same thing that the Blaxploitation movies went through. The NAACP boycotted the show, and there was this big push, not so much to cancel the show, but was to open up doors and opportunities and create more jobs for Black people in television. But instead, they just canceled Amos and Andy, and it killed the careers of all Black people in television for over a decade. And in the book that I'm working on, one of the things that I've speculated is that there was not a Black director in television until, I want to say, 67 or 68. So there was, at this point, television had been around for well over a decade. And Amos and Andy was the show that was going to give us the first Black television director. There's no getting around it, because one of the stars of Amos and Andy was one of the biggest directors of race films. He was the one person still working in Hollywood who knew how to direct. But they killed the show, and they killed everybody's opportunity. And then you don't get anything until, in terms of narrative television, the first show to to hire a black director, and we were talking about him earlier, was the Bill Cosby Show. We're not going to get into the fact that Bill Cosby is a horrible human being. We are going to get into the fact that he was the first person to demand that there were black directors on his TV show. That was like 1969 or 70, and before him there was a couple directors, and on variety shows, Laugh-In had a couple directors. But we kept getting cut off at the knees, right? We kept, like the opportunities kept getting cut short. Happened in the 70s, it started to happen again in the 80s, and it wasn't until into the 90s when, you know, John Singleton came along with Boys in the Hood, and Reggie Hudlin came along with House Party. Those two movies were truly significant. But you also don't want to leave out Townsend and Hollywood Shuffle. You don't want to leave out what Spike Lee did, what Keenan Ivory Wayans did. Keenan Ivory Wayans, the Wayans family, is the most successful, not only the most successful black family in film and TV, but they're one of the most successful. They're like the Coppolas, right? There's so many of them, and they've generated so much revenue. But no one ever talks about the Wayans brothers or the Wayans family too, because there's some sisters there. And so I'm just sitting here like, I'm rambling now, because I'm like, again, it's been so long since I've watched this, and I'm also thinking, oh God, man, I made this movie, I was like 100 pounds, not as fat as I am now, and I had hair, and I was like, you know, I was so devilishly handsome back then, and now I feel like an old man.
Take a moment to open it up to the audience, the students and community members, a few chance to ask questions. Yeah.
Especially for you, sir.
Yes.
Do you think that Sweetback was the only movie of the genre that was made by and for black people? And do you think that every subsequent movie after that was made and controlled by executives?
No, not even close. So many of them were, I shouldn't say so many of them, but there are significant ones. I mean, The Spook Who Sat by the Door was definitely made for us and by us. Oh God, what else is there? I'm trying to think off the top of my head. The Spook Who Sat by the Door is a big one. Melinda, there was a movie called Melinda that came out in 72, 73, and that was one of those unique films where it was written, produced, directed, and financed by black people, had an all-black cast. It was the first movie that was the movie that gave Jim Kelly his big break. And there were a few others too, you know, and of course I'm drawing a blank on them, but there was, you know, like Sweetback set a template that people tried to emulate, but they didn't really understand what, I mean, it's like now you look at it, it's like when you watch a DC movie, it's like DC is trying to do what Marvel does without understanding how Marvel does it, right? And so you watch a lot of the Blaxploitation movies and it's like, no, it's not enough to just put some black actors in it, have the women take their clothes off, have the men shoot guns, and have them go after Whitey, right? It's like, that's not enough. But there was a handful of films out there that did it, but there was also a lot of films where they were kind of subversive in what they did, right? So like, I talk about this all the time. There's a movie called Blackula, which was, you know, Blackula, Dracula's soul brother. And, you know, like that movie is actually really subversive in a lot of ways. And the subversion came through the actor, William Marshall, who was cast as Blackula. He was this classically trained Shakespearean actor. And when they hired him, like, he was the one who demanded that the character of Blackula be an African prince who was fighting against slavery in the 1700s and then was cursed by Dracula and turned into a vampire. Originally, Blackula was like a slave named Amos or something like that. And it was literally about a slave who gets turned into a vampire, and that was it. And William Marshall refused to do that. He was like, you know, I want to see something different on the screen. So he brought that. And I did the audio commentary for the Blu-ray of that years ago, and I was talking about it, and when you watch the movie, like, spoiler alert, like when Blackula gets killed at the end, he's killed by the cops. He's killed by the LAPD. And you're watching this movie and you're realizing that, like, he was turned into a monster by a white man, Dracula, who wanted to curse him and turn him into a monster. Like, how is that for subversion? Because that's what racism does in America. It's all about turning black folks and queer folks and trans folks and all these, and all the people who are the others. It's all about turning us into monsters and then finding an excuse to kill us, right? That's what Blackula is all about, right? Like, even if they didn't intend for it to be about that, that's what it's about now when you watch it, you know? So you just have to you gotta sit through a lot of garbage to get through the good movies. You know, no one should ever have to watch a movie called Speeding Up Time, because it's the first film I've ever seen that actually makes time go in reverse. And you just sit there and you go, why is there a car chase in an empty parking lot where it's just people going in a circle, right? You know, so, but yeah, I hope that answered your question. Anyone else? Come on.
The other panelists, feel free to.
Yeah, I do have one question. I mean, when I watch it, I noticed like most of the clips, like new shows, that are like male characters. So I watched, so in the film we watched the Cleopatra Jones and Coffee. So just wondering like, because I said I'm learning just like in terms of this genre, what's the, I mean, are there maybe more, I mean, the number of exploitation films with the female stars, leading roles?
Yeah, I know. If there's one thing that I blew in this movie was that. That's my single biggest regret. So the two actresses I needed to have interviews with, I never got interviews with. Tamara Dobson, who played Cleopatra Jones, literally was like, had disappeared. People didn't even know if she was alive or dead. And it was like, I was trying to find her, and I would call these random numbers that people would give me. Well, this is the last number we had for her, and there was just nothing. I couldn't get her. And then there was Pam Grier, and I had to have Pam Grier, and I couldn't get her. Like, there was a couple opportunities that fell apart, and my naivete and my youth and my immaturity at the time when I was making this was like, well, if I don't have them, I can't really talk about the women, right? I had an interview with Gloria Hendry, who had a few small parts, Roseanne Caton, who had a few even smaller parts, and like, for whatever reason, like, I look back at myself now and I'm like, I should have tried harder, because I see, just between Cleopatra Jones, the two Cleopatra Jones movies, and then Pam Grier did like 4 or 5 movies, really changed a lot of stuff. And someone was actually talking to me the other day, and they were like, well, maybe you need to do a sequel. And I was like, no, maybe you need to do the sequel, because I'm tired and old. You know, and I was actually I spent some time with Pam Grier a couple weeks ago, and I don't think she would do a documentary, because she's got some projects of her own that would conflict with that. And none of the other, you know, Tamara Dobson actually did die at some point, and but that's my biggest regret. That's the, you know, if there's one thing I really blew with this film, that was it. I really did not get into specifically how much Pam Grier's films, even more than Cleopatra Jones, because it really was Pam's, how it changed not just how black women were portrayed in films, because she destroyed everything that came before that, but it was also how women were portrayed in films, because up until that point, there were no women action heroes. There were no women, you know, once in a while you got a random movie here or there, or something like, you know, Boxcar Bertha or something like that, or what was the one that Angie Dickinson did, with a Big Bad Mama. Once in a while you get something like that, but like really, Coffee and Foxy Brown, especially those two. Then you throw in Cleopatra Jones, then you throw in Pam's other movies, really changed so much. But again, I was too young and dumb and immature to understand that, or to understand, and also to understand the importance of talking about it, at least in a minuscule way, the way I understand it now. But you know, you can only go back in time never, so you can't, you know, how do you fix it? So maybe it's up to one of you to do that documentary, you know?
I want to make a movie cast.
No, I was, as I was watching it, as I was watching the movie, I was, and especially because again, I was just with Pam 2 weeks ago, like 3 weeks ago, and in fact, because she was coming to Portland where I live, and she was supposed to be coming this weekend, and the people that were putting together the event called me and said, Pam's coming to town, and she wants you to moderate the Q&A, she wants to hang out with you, and I said, you know, when is it? And they said, oh, it's the, you know, the weekend of the, you know, the 20, what is this? What is it today? Anyway, it's whenever this is. And I was like, you know, oh, I'm going to Illinois, I'm going to Chicago and Normal, Illinois, and can we, and then I reached out to you, and I was like, is there any chance we can change this date? And there was like this, the pause was just long enough for me to go, no, I shouldn't have even asked. And then I was like, I'm not going to be able to do it, sorry. And then they told Pam I wasn't going to be able to do it, and then she said, well, what are the dates he's around? And I said, I could do this. And then she was like, yep, let's do it. And so we were hanging out, and it was really like, I mean, Pam Grier is one of the nicest people I've ever met, and I really would like to see, I'd like to see something that acknowledges everything that she has done. But I suspect, well, no, I actually know she's working on something that will hopefully do that. So, but I do think someone needs to make a documentary about it. And I think that documentary could be bigger than just Pam or Cleopatra Jones, and we could, you know, if I were to do something like that now, I think I would, first off, I'm not the person to do it. Like, there's somebody who's smarter than I am, who knows more about aspects of how feminism are portrayed in movies, but also about destroying the patriarchy in the film industries. And I'm the person who will consult and, like, you know, you can do this, come on, don't give up. But I would drop dead if I had to make another documentary at this point. Them shits is hard to make.
Well, you know, we got a lot of black women who could probably step in and do that.
Yes.
At this point, so. But, you know, one thing I did want to say about the documentary, you know, I think, and you were talking about this, alluding to this a little earlier, you do create a beautiful space to go beyond just the good and the bad, right? There's that conversation where we can think about, you know, what blaxploitation does, right? Beyond just that critique of it. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Right? Are these people portraying these tropes of blackness? You know, so maybe you could speak a little bit. Did you intentionally think about doing that when you were doing the film?
Oh no.
But when you look back at it now, though, do you see that possibility of there being that third space there?
Yeah, no, what happened was, I'd never made a documentary film before. I didn't know what I was doing. And I only had like 4 or 5 prepared questions that I was just gonna ask everybody, right? And then by the 3rd or 4th interview, I was like, well, this isn't gonna work. Like, if I do this isn't gonna work. I need to shake things up. And I was trying to figure out how to shake things up, and then I happened to interview Ron O'Neill really early in the process. He was probably the 4th or 5th person I interviewed. And his interview was like, oh my God, there's so much more here that I have to do. And so that changed the line of questioning that I started asking. And so fortunately it came early enough that I was able to shake things up. And it was really, you know, I thought this would be a cute little documentary of like, hey, whatever happened to, where are they now, sort of thing. And what had happened was, at the time, I shot 3 or 4 rounds of interviews in '96 and '97. And as I was shooting those interviews, most of these people had not done any interviews since the mid-'70s, right? You know, and none of them had been on camera. There'd been, you know, a couple magazines here and there that might have done like a Where Are They Now piece. But Jim Kelly, I was the first person to interview Jim Kelly on camera in like over a decade, and William Marshall hadn't been interviewed in over a decade, Rudy Ray Moore, all these people. And so they really opened up to me in a way that I think it was a combination of my sort of youthful naivete of going, hey, tell me about, what are your feelings about Blaxploitation? But then also just like, oh, someone wants to hear what they have to say. And they really opened up, and Ron O'Neill was the one that made me really understand, like, okay, you got to take this whole subject seriously. You got to respect that. And I never went in with disrespect, but that you really need to respect this. And the craziest interview of all of them was Glynn Turman. Because Glynn Turman, I was convinced that was the worst interview I had. And what had happened was I was interviewing Roseanne Caton, and Roseanne Caton was like, oh my God, Glynn Turman has the funniest story about how he went into Sam Markoff's office. Sam Markoff was the head of American International Pictures, which produced a ton of these movies. And so she's telling me the story about Glynn Turman in a meeting with Sam Markoff and the argument they got into. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna have to interview Glynn Turman. So I tracked Glynn Turman down, I go to his house, we set up the camera, and I start the interview with Roseanne Caton tells me this story about this argument you had with Sam Markoff. He's like, I had an argument with Sam Markoff? And I was like, well, that's what Roseanne Caton said. And he's like, yeah, I don't remember that. And then I was like, immediately was like, wah, wah, wah. And so I continue on with the interview, but the voice in my head is like, you gotta get him to tell his story, you gotta get him to tell his story. And I wasn't listening to a single thing he said in the interview, right? I was so obsessed, and I kept coming back to, are you sure you don't remember this story about Sam Markoff? And he was like, no, I don't. But he's saying he was saying these profound things. Nearly a year later, when I'm editing the movie, I was like, God, too bad Glynn Turman didn't say anything interesting at all. That's what I said, at all. It's like, well, let me watch the interview one more time. And then I sat and just watched it from beginning to end, and at some point I was like, holy shit, this is part of what's missing from this movie, right? And again, it was this learning process. It was like, and from that point on, I went back and I watched every single interview again, and I was listening not for just what I wanted to hear, but what they were saying. And the moment I started listening to what everybody was saying, really saying, then it really started to take shape. And then the footage was stolen from me for over a year, and so I couldn't work on it. And then I finally got the footage back, and then I couldn't afford to rent. It was such a long process that it was really heartbreaking. And I dedicated the film to William Marshall, but the person I created, the two people I had the best relationship with post filming was Rudy Ray Moore, who over the years I got to know pretty well, and then Ron O'Neill. And Ron O'Neill and I had hit it off so well, we were trying to raise money to make an actual, a movie together, right? I wanted to do this sort of, my version of the Limey, only it was gonna be the Blackie, and it was this aging Blaxploitation guy. And we lost contact with each other probably around 2001, 2002. William Marshall died. I dedicated the film to William Marshall. I finally got this cut was done, and I was like, okay, the one person I've got to call is I've got to call Ron O'Neill. I got to get in touch with him. I've got to let him know I finally finished this thing. We've got to get back on track with what we were trying to do. And then Ron O'Neill died, and it was like, oh my God. And so as I was watching this today, I was like, Ron O'Neill is dead. Rudy Ray Moore is dead. Jim Kelly is dead. Dr. Clayton is dead. Dr. Hill is dead. Dean Knowledge is dead. There's so many people that are gone now. And I was just I was getting misty-eyed up there because I was like, I got to know, some of these people I got to know really well. I mean, Dr. Hill was my mentor. Dr. Clayton really opened up my mind to the possibilities of what film was beyond the 70s, because I was, at the time, was just really obsessed with the 70s. And it was some of the historians that were like, now you got to go back and look at what came before, because you're never going to fully understand what happened. And I believe that now. If you're studying film right now, you will never be able to fully understand movies right now if you don't look at everything that came, well, not every movie obviously, but look at the history of the motion picture industry and how our identities are shaped by popular entertainment. And when you start to see that, you kind of like get sickened by a lot of it, so. I don't know, was that? Yes, there's two, three maybe, but yes.
I was kind of trailing off of what you're saying. One of the actresses was kind of talking about how it's a little bit of an issue of how we kind of always seek a role model in a movie and how not necessarily every single movie is about finding a role model or even finding someone that you particularly relate to. Sometimes a movie is just for an entertainment aspect, or it is to find out something about others that you don't know much about, not necessarily about seeing yourself or seeing yourself reflected in a movie, depending on, I guess, what kind of audience you're coming from, too.
Yeah, I think I mean, I was just sort of fortunate enough that I figured out early on, like, that it was all make-believe. And so, you know, as much as I loved Jim Kelly as a kid, I was like, yeah, he's just a man, you know? And it was interesting because I'm, you know, like I said, a couple weeks ago, I'm hanging out with Pam Grier, she's about to turn 75. And, you know, like, men are still trying to sleep with her. Like, she's still a sex symbol, right? And we were talking about that, and she was like, nobody really wants to be a sex symbol. She's like, I don't think of myself as that, but she's like, but do you know, and she said to me, do you know what it's like to know that every straight man I meet wants to sleep with me and has fantasized about me? And she goes, and I know even you have too. And I'm just like, no, Miss Greer, I've never done that, you know? So I mean, I think that speaks to a larger problem. That larger problem is the importance that we put on our popular entertainment and our entertainers. And not only is it an unrealistic thing to do, it's unhealthy to do as well. And so, you know, but how do we undo that, right? And I think that the reality is that, like, it's, I don't know if there's a societal fix. It's almost like an individual fix. It's almost like I have to say to you and all of you, hey, don't ascribe too much value to this. Put the value in yourself, right? But we see it all the time. We see it when, you know, we've seen how people lose their mind over Star Wars, right? Like, you know, and it's like, so many of us can't divorce our opinion or our appreciation for certain things from our own self-worth.
It's losing a part of, like, maybe the meaning of a certain piece of artwork.
Yeah.
Inserting yourself into it.
Yeah, and it's kind of crazy how that happens, but it happens so much. I mean, I can tell you, I spent years working as a film critic for a newspaper, and the most death threats, I mean, honest God, death threats I ever got, there was 2 movies. One was whatever the second of the Star Wars prequels was. It wasn't Attack of the Clowns. It was the Attack of the Clowns was the second one.
Sure.
yeah. But people threatened to kill me for that. And then the other one was Tyler Perry's was it Diary of a Mad Black Woman or whatever it was. And I was like, there's things I'm willing to die for, but not these movies, and not for the fact that you think I should die because I didn't like them, and I've never, like, you know, unlike a lot of people, I do believe there's a thing called justifiable homicide, but it's not, you know, it's not over like a movie, right? It's when your children are being held hostage or something like that. Then you go in guns a-blazing. So, yeah, but I think that's like the psychology department. That's what all y'all need to figure out. That ain't me. I'm just a writer. I don't know nothing. So, you had a question, I think. Yes.
Yeah. So obviously you were young at the time when you made this, and meeting all of these stars who were so like influential to you when you were younger. Did you find yourself like starstruck when you first met them, or like Rudy Ray Moore especially, because I'm sort of a Rudy Ray Moore fan, and seeing him, I was like, oh, he's probably gonna be in this, and he was exactly like how I envisioned he would be, based on like PDB Scrum and like Dolomite, and I was like, there's no way this man's actually like this, and he totally was.
So, you know, I wasn't there was a brief moment with Jim Kelly that I was a little bit starstruck. Everybody else, there were moments where I was like, wow, like Jim Brown is literally the most intimidating human being I've ever been around, period, ever. And to this day. But everybody else, I felt like if I went in too starstruck, too much like a fanboy, like I wouldn't get respect from them. But Rudy was crazy because I met up with Rudy before we did the interview at Roscoe's Chicken and Waffles in LA on Gower. And it was on a Sunday morning, so it was pretty crowded, and you would have thought Jesus Christ had walked into the building, right? Like, Roscoe's Chicken and Waffles is like, you know, one of the black mainstays of LA. And Rudy walked in and everybody recognized him. And it was the coolest thing because he walked in as Rudy, everybody recognized him, and he turned into Dolomite. And I could see it happen. And he's like, yo, what's up, brother? What's up? What's happening? And then he sat down and he was just Rudy. And then we drove from Roscoe's Chicken and Waffles to the place we did the interview. And I was in my car, he was in his car, and he followed me, and he was driving so slow. He was driving like a really old man. And like there was this and so I'm having to drive slow so he can keep up with me, and there's this trail of cars behind him, and everybody's honking their horn, and I can see him in the rearview mirror, and he's like, and I'm going, wow, Dolomite drives like a really old man. And it was like this, it was this great moment. And the thing about Rudy that I loved was that, you know, he was from like deep Arkansas or something like that. And so he spoke country. And like I would listen to his interview and I'd be like, there's times I can't even understand what he's saying. He'd go deep into this deep Southern accent. But he was the person I really got to know over the years, because I would see him like at different events and different festivals, and we would have these conversations. And I saw him, he passed away in 2008. The last time I saw him was probably 6-7 months before he died. And we were at an event up in Seattle, and we were just, and at that point he was pretty old, and he got around in like a little electric scooter, wheelchair sort of thing. And we were eating dinner, and he just kept dozing off. And it was like, and like everybody was like, Jesus Christ, did Rudy just die? You know? And it was like, but you know, I sat down and I talked to him, and I had said, at that point, I didn't realize it when we made the documentary, but Rudy was like older than most of those actors back in that time. When he made Dolomite, which was in 75, he was already pushing 50, right? He lied about his age for a long time to seem younger. And so I realized that Rudy had grown up watching all the race movies from the 30s and 40s, that he'd seen them. And I realized that Dolomite and Human Tornado especially are a variation of the race movies from the 40s, and they follow very similar templates, and they have the musical numbers, and they have the comedy numbers, and then they have these flimsy, you know, gangster plots. And I was like, no one has ever really talked about that. And so we were sitting there having dinner, and I said, Rudy, you know, I've known you for about 10 years now, and I gotta ask you a question. I was like, you know, I was thinking, like, your movies remind me a lot of, like, you know, Oscar Michaud's movies and Spencer Williams' movies, and the movies that, like, you know, the Toddy Brothers and $1 Million Productions was doing in the 30s and 40s. And I'm just like, were those your influences at all? And he just looked at me and he goes, you're the first person ever asked me that. He was like, that's exactly what I was trying to do. And I was like, patting myself on the back, you know, and feeling good about it. But no, I never got overly starstruck. But I did get starstruck the first time I met Pam Grier. I really did. And it was like, in part because it had taken me so long to finally meet her in person. And it just felt like, you know, like, it was like, God damn, that's Pam Grier. Like I think at the end of the day, Pam Grier had a greater influence than even the men of that era. And I don't think it, I know it. Because even before Fred Williamson, Jim Brown, Jim Kelly, Ron O'Neill, and Rudy, before all those guys, you had, Woody Strode was doing his thing to break down the barriers, and Sidney Poitier was doing his thing, and Harry Belafonte had done his thing. There were some precedents before. There was no precedent for what you saw when Pam Grier showed up in Coffee. It wasn't her first film, but it was her first starring role. There was never anything ever like that in the history of film, what Pam Grier did in Coffee. It's plain and simple as that. And so that level of shock and awe was pretty amazing. And then like 10 seconds later, she was like, I know you want to fuck me. And I was like, okay, it's all over. You've ruined this, Pam. And that broke down the barrier. Like, she literally said that to me. We met for dinner. This was the first time we met, was in 2017. And she just came straight out and said, what you want, And I was like, well, not really, but maybe, so. Any other questions? Anyone else have?
I think we got time for one more.
I'll go.
Sure.
Well, I'm a big fan of Pam Grier as well, as both Eric and Stanford know. And she's one of the only people from this era, certainly of the pastiche that you presented here, that had a career beyond. This is my intro music. That had a career beyond and was seen in film as she aged, right? The other folks, their youth is memorialized in this blip in the film genre, and then we don't really see them again. So I wonder how each kind of grappled with their, maturity, their mortality, the aging process in those two different contexts. Pam Grier is a 75-year-old sex symbol. So are the other women, but they didn't watch themselves age on film,
Turn this back on, because I think mine is the one that's causing the feedback. Okay, here we go. Here, you can take the one that doesn't work anymore. That's a good question. I mean, again, so many of those people so many of them I haven't seen in ages. There was a lot of bitterness. I had to work really hard to keep as much of the bitterness as I could out of this movie. Ron O'Neal was the one who I let his come through because there was no way you could hide it, right? And, but everybody else there was this feeling of like, we're all past our prime and we never really got a chance to show ourselves off. And then of course there's just the things you just don't make it into the cut of the movie. And there was a movie that had just come out in '96 called Original Gangsters, which had Fred Williamson, Jim Brown, Ron O'Neal, Pam Grier in it. And that was sort of billed as the return of the black action stars. And so, like, I started doing my interviews right after that movie had come out, and there was this feeling at the time of like, oh, maybe we're all gonna get another chance, and Pam got another chance in Jackie Brown, which I think is not only her best film, but it's also Quentin Tarantino's best film. But nobody else really got the chance, and I think there was just sort of this, at that moment, there was this like, maybe we're gonna get it, but there were some of them that said to me like, I don't get why, Spike Lee doesn't offer me any jobs. I don't get why, and it was like, well, by that time, Wesley Snipes was about to be anointed, or he may have already been anointed at that point. He was the thing. And Denzel his career was, there were already 3 or 4 leading men, Whoopi Goldberg was still, people forget like what a big star Whoopi Goldberg really was. Like Whoopi Goldberg was the highest grossing black actress of all time for a very long time. And do you want to know who the number 2 and 3 highest grossing black actresses were? Black men in fat suits as women. Like seriously, it was that bad. And I think, looking back, there was a lot of people were just sort of defeated. and also trying to come to grips with the fact that the one that was the hardest was Jim Kelly, I think, because it was like, how do you live at being a living legend who doesn't get work anymore? You know, and then other people found things to do. Fred Williamson kept making really crappy movies. Jim Brown got involved in his, you know, his stuff, you know, a lot of philanthropy and activism. But there was always a sense of bitterness and sadness. And again, at the time, I don't think, with the exception of Rudy, I don't think anybody had even hit 60 yet. I think the oldest person was like around 58 or 59 when I was doing these interviews. And, you know, but I also didn't want to, Antonio Fargas talked about a little bit. He was like, yeah, you know, it kind of sucks. It kind of sucks. I think he was the one who said it sucks being a has-been. Somebody said, I can't remember who it was, somebody said, you know, it really sucks being a has-been. He said, but it's better than being a never-was-been. It's like, okay, you got to keep that in mind, you know. I saw an interview recently with, of all people, Dee Snider of the group Twisted Sister. Some of you may not know who Twisted Sister is. I would encourage you to go home and look them up. But Dee Snider's pushing 70 now. But he was talking about the shelf life of like heavy metal acts in the 80s. And he was like, you know, yeah, we had our time. And most people who get the time that we had only have it for a certain amount of time. And it's the same thing with actors. There's only a handful of actors and actresses that really get to have that super longevity. And it's worse for women. We know that, right? Because Stallone still gets to be an action star even though he's 70 something, and Schwarzenegger's tapered off a little bit, but we live in a really sexist, patriarchal society that you know, I'd be preaching to the choir if I went any further than that. But I do think it's really sad that when you see an entire generation of talent, and we really did. That's what happened in the 70s, is an entire generation of talent went away. And it wasn't like it was obvious where they went. You kind of have to look and go, well, gee, what happened to Brenda Sykes? What happened to Calvin Lockhart? What happened to, there's this long list. A lot of them showed up on episodes of Murder, She Wrote, but not all of them, you know, so.
I think you can hear it a little bit in them when they say we just needed more time.
Yeah.
You know?
And the thing is, as I am now the age that they all were, or so many of them were, like I understand that we just need more time. Like I'm not down and out for the count. I don't ever want to do another documentary that takes 6-7 years to finish, but I still have some good years in me, you know, knock on wood. And that's also really interesting about watching this movie all these years later is, you know, like now I understand what it means to be, you know, looking over your shoulder at someone who's 30 years younger than you, who can they can run a little bit faster, they can jump a little bit higher, and they're willing to work for less money than you are because they don't understand their true value. So.
On that note, we need to start wrapping up. Dr. Carpenter, any closing words?
Can I ask one last question?
You're gonna have to hand that microphone back.
Who says I'm asking you the question? Oh. No, I mean, what I think was interesting is like we've talked about what was, we've talked about what is, and I kind of want to ask, it's a speculative question. What do you think is next?
That's a great question. Well, for me, there's a lot of jealousy and envy because I look at guys like, not just guys, but I look at like filmmakers like Jordan Peele and Donald Glover, the person who just did American Fiction, the woman who directed Till, you know, Ava DuVernay, Regina King is directing. I look at all of them, and most of them are younger than me, and I get really mad because I feel like that's what I was trying to do 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. But I think that I see this generation between their mid-30s and into their mid-40s that are like, man, they're primed, they're ready to go. All of these things that all these other filmmakers who came before them, all these other actors, all these people who busted their ass to break down the doors. Like, again, the generations that lost out on work, there's finally a generation here that I feel like, I'm not gonna say there's no stopping them, but like when I watched Atlanta, I saw things that I wanted to do and never thought I could do. I saw things that I never would have thought to do. When I watched American Fiction, I was like, I can't believe this movie got made. It was like, because it's the sort of movie I wanted for so long. When I watched The Color Purple, the new version of The Color Purple, you know, the director of that's from Africa, right? And so I think, we're never gonna get to a place that is like perfect for all of us, but I do feel like knowing how this country is, knowing how the society is, like, it's not great, but it's still better than it ever was right now in terms of film, in terms of television. Now, streaming has had this massive impact, and I think we're gonna see a time where certain things regress, but like, Atlanta changed everything, right? You know, the fact that Judas and the Black Messiah got made, I never thought I would see a movie about, you know, Chairman Fred and the Illinois Black Panther Party, but I saw it, right? And it was a great movie, and Lakeith Stanfield was like so amazing as a despicable human being, and Daniel Kaluuya was like, you know, everybody was like, well, he's British and he don't look nothing like Fred Hampton. And I was like, yeah, but he sounded just like Fred Hampton. He had that speech pattern down, right? Now, I just saw that the trailer for the Shirley Chisholm movie, and they just made a movie about Bayard Rustin, and Coleman Domingo has been nominated for an Oscar, which he probably won't win, and neither will Jeffrey Wright, because they're probably gonna give it to that scrawny white dude from Oppenheimer, but that's okay. You know, but again, they made a movie about Shirley Chisholm. They made a movie about Bayard Rustin. And there's so many things that are coming out now. I want to see more of them. I want to see the growth. And I think we're going to see it. I don't think it's ever going to be like ideal for anybody. But I don't think that's ever going to be ideal for anybody. That's what it comes down to. But I'm really, and you've known me long enough to know that I seldom say that I'm optimistic about things. But there is a level of optimism that I have that, you know, really, even with Black Panther, it's like, Black Panther made over $1 billion at the movies, the global box office, right? For decades, they used to say, you know, movies with Black people cannot be sold overseas. And it was like, well, why are you saying that? Well, just because. And they proved it was wrong, right? And so I think that I think film, there's always gonna be good movies and there's always gonna be crappy movies. So, yeah. Oh, there's more questions? We're gonna keep going?
No, I was gonna just add something to that.
Oh, okay.
One thing that I think is telling and great about the Spider-Verse movies and Black Panther is those are two movies where there's something that I thought when I was watching it, and something that amongst all of my contemporaries, I would hear some version of this, which, and even you said some version of this at a Comic-Con once. It's like, it was that, you know, just this idea of like, imagine what my life would be if I had that as a child.
Yes, and that's, so you just hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
That's the key thing, right? Should I end with my 1978 story?
Yes.
Okay, so 1978, I'm 10 years old. I go to see Superman the movie, and the ad campaign, you will believe a man can fly. And I'm watching the movie. I grew up right outside New York City. Most of the exteriors were shot in New York, and I knew this is New York City. I'm accepting this metropolis. And the And all of a sudden, at one point in the movie, Clark Kent takes off his clothes and he's Superman and he's about to take off and he runs past a pimp. And the pimp, played by an actor named Bo Rucker, says, and I quote, "Say, Jim, that's a bad outfit." And 10 years old, it was in that moment I realized, I hadn't seen another black person in this movie. And this is the only black person I've gotten. I'm 10 years old. And I was like, I don't know if I want to finish watching this movie. I was so offended, I was brokenhearted, I was broken-spirited. And in that moment, I was like, I don't ever want to feel this way again, right? Now, I'm not gonna say no kid is ever gonna have to feel that way again. Black Panther, like, imagine if I had gotten Black Panther instead of Bo Rucker as the pimp with the that single moment. And that was what we got, kids my age were getting in the 70s. Obviously there was the Blaxploitation movies, which I was too young to go see at the time. But there's so much stuff to be seen, and there's so much, when William Marshall says at the end, he says, we have to learn to activate our dreams. And if we don't learn to activate our dreams, it's nothing but the repetition of what we've experienced in the past, which is disdain. Black Panther, what Ryan Coogler did, what all those people did, that was the activation of the dream. It was an activation of the dream. And that to me is like so profound, because William Marshall said, this is what we have to do, and we did it. Somebody did it. And we'll see it again. We'll see it, it's gonna go in bits and pieces and jumps and starts, and there'll be setbacks. And it was like you were saying, the debate over American fiction. There's always gonna be this debate, because ultimately the question is, what is black? What does it mean to be black? You tell me, because I don't know. I have an idea, but most of my idea has been formed by popular culture. It's been formed by popular culture that was informed by white supremacy. And so, I don't know. But maybe we'll find out together.
We'll have to let that be the last word for now, but I'm sure that we'll find other opportunities to jam again sometime. To our panelists.
Bring him back as a scholar in residence.
Oh, damn. So, Mr. Walker, Dr. Zeng, Dr. Craig, thank you very much for taking your time to talk with us, to talk with our class, to share your perspectives, your experiences. This was just wonderful. So, thank you for taking the time to interact with our community.
No, thank you for having me. This was great. Thanks for sticking out, staying out late. It's past everyone's bedtime. But a big shout out to Damien Duffy, because he came all the way from, how far away did you come? You came from Champaign. That's like hours and hours away, right? Say it was hours and hours. Okay, thank you. You went through time zones and everything, right? So, but everybody, thank you so much for coming out. I appreciate it. This has been great. Thank you.